All right. Let's take up then another issue related to culture and society that will kind of be an important one. Church and state. You can see how this remains a perennial issue for Christians. Even up to today, Christians struggle with the issue of how should the church and the state relate. It's one thing when you're on the outskirts, when you have no power. It's another thing when you are beginning to be recognized by the power. It's another thing when you are the power. And in fact, in the West, of course, the church sometimes actually filling the gap for the state. They provided many public services and provided other types of issues as well, or services as well. So essentially you have this question of authority. Who has the authority in which realms? And of course, one thing that's tied up with this is the idea of the church is a universal authority, conceptually, right? That the church is an authority over all groups of people, genders, sexes, ages. But is the church an authority over the emperor or a king? So there are a variety of divergent views on this issue. And certainly, in the time period we're talking about, there are places where the church has a lot of influence because it's connected to prominent cities. In other places, the outskirts of what was at one point the Western Roman Empire, there's less of a presence. And destruction of churches, the migrations of people fleeing Germanic invasions. And so the migrations kind of hurt the outskirts, but in other places, as they're getting into the city of Rome, for example, while that's causing a transition in political power, it provides the church opportunity to exert some cultural power. So how should church and state relate, given the Christian empire and the ways that we're in all these events that are coming about? Essentially, we see kind of two models that are predominant. Again, a lot of it depending upon which side of the empire you're looking at. In the eastern part is what's often referred to as the Constantinian model. There's still emperors in the east. And those emperors tended to follow the example of Constantine. And so, would involve themselves in church matters in order to keep the peace. And this continued throughout the early Middle Ages. But it wasn't just the emperors promoting this. Sometimes even the theologians in the East approved of these interactions. And so here's the emperor being involved in the church with the acceptance of and even approval of church leaders as well. We talked about last Tuesday the Emperor Justinian. And we see in Justinian an example of this kind of integration of church and state in the role of the emperor. Justinian, like Constantine, called for councils. And when there were issues that were coming up, it wasn't the bishops or the patriarchs who decided when to call a council. It was the emperor saying a council needs to be addressing this. And not only is he calling the council, he would often control their proceedings and how the things were run. Justinian as well, of course, is perhaps the premier example of this because of his skill, his education as a theologian. So not only is he an emperor, he's also defending the church against heresy. And so he's writing theological treatises about a variety of religious topics. He's deposing bishops or patriarchs who he feels need to be removed. He's excommunicating individuals. He's sending people into exile based on religious issues. Any Manichaeans under his rule were under the death penalty. Montanists and Gnostics, although few in number by this point, faced harsh action because of their heretical views. We talked about some of the restrictions Jews faced. All citizens faced baptism, including, of course, the baptism of children. And there were even elements of the Code of Justinian that were religious in nature as well. Right? And so it's a revision of the Roman code, but it's also bringing in elements of Christian practice and theology. And so there were laws on theology, there were laws on worship, there were laws related to church structure. All of these are this integration of church and state. One law title, for example, was on the highest Trinity and on the Catholic faith, and that no one dare debate about these matters publicly. Okay? That's a law. Right? This is what the Trinity is, and you cannot publicly debate what the Trinity is. There were laws about bishops and clergy, heresy, apostasy, the repression of paganism. All of these were a part of the Code of Justinian. The laws also included the regulation of monasteries, who was allowed to minister in the main church in Constantinople, known as the Hagia Sophia, or the Church of Holy Wisdom, a church that Justinian built in Constantinople. And so in the eastern part, it was very integrated. And these two organizations kind of supported each other in one sense, but also it was the church supporting the emperor as a religious figure as well. In the western part of Europe, however, things were slightly different. Given that so much of the government had moved east, beginning with Constantine, and then gradually deteriorated throughout the West, it's no surprise that they didn't have this kind of integrated model like you would see in the East. Instead, Western theologians spoke of two spheres or two kingdoms, the churchly sphere and the state. In most cases, Western theologians wanted to keep the emperor or any sort of king out of the church. And the government should not have any influence on what happens in church. But not necessarily the other way around. Right? The church is the universal authority, so the church can have some say in government, but the government should not have a say in the church. Palaces belong to the emperor, wrote Ambrose, churches to the bishops. Now, that didn't mean, of course, that emperors didn't have certain religious duties for Western theologians. They were responsible for the suppression of heresy, for example. But those duties were done under the authority of the church. And so any sort of religious duty that the emperor had was not imposed upon the church, but was under the guidance of the church. Gelasius I, for example, wrote a letter to Anastasius I, who was emperor in Constantinople, and said, there are two realms. The priestly realm, the church realm, was the more weighty of the two. And in fact, the priest must give an account to God. Now, certainly, rulers in the West often ignored these things. So Frankish kings, for example, we talked about how Charlemagne got involved in some of that. We'll see that more in the second half of the Middle Ages. And so the popes, despite their assertion that the church was higher than the government, often found themselves having to obey imperial decrees, having to obey the things from either the East or the West. We've already touched on some of this before, but the Middle Ages often, it allowed for the authority of the Pope to rise. But it allowed for the power of bishops to rise in general. And largely the city-state model, especially in the West, really allowed for the bishops to rise to a lot of authority. And the city-state organization kind of distanced itself from various places, and so the bishops became very important leaders. This allowed those territorial divisions of Rome to continue. because the Roman Empire had been broken up into territories or dioceses, and with these city-states, that allowed that to continue. It allowed the administrative organization of the Roman Empire to continue. It's not exactly the same, but it was enough of a structure that it gave the bishops an authority. In fact, it even allowed the Latin language to continue. The bishops weren't just over religious issues. They became involved in local courts. They became judicial figures where people would go to them for rulings not related to religious matters. So this system became a way for bishops to gain power. Another aspect of culture and society that continued to be a challenge is the issue of classical learning. What do you do about Greek and Roman philosophy, the classics? How are those to be reviewed, or how are those to be viewed? And we've mentioned, throughout the class already, that there are these tensions that exist within Christianity, where some people, like Tertullian and others, felt that if people spent too much time studying classical Greek and Roman literature, they would be drawn away from Christianity. And so this was something to be avoided. Others, however, were more open to it, believing that there were things that could be gained from this kind of study. Ironically, much of the preservation of classical learning among Christians was due to monks. Often the manuscripts related to these pieces of literature were copied in monasteries. Now, certainly, I don't want to discount, as we'll see later, the importance of Islam and Muslims in all of this. When we get to the later Middle Ages and see this kind of renewed interest in Aristotle, it's because of the Muslims that have copied these manuscripts. And so Muslim philosophers are dealing with Aristotle. And it's through Islamic philosophy that someone like Thomas Aquinas becomes interested in Aristotle. So a lot of classical learning is preserved by Muslims, but for those Christians that are preserving it, often it was in monasteries. We've mentioned this before, but I think, of course, it's interesting enough to repeat that part of the way people are justifying the maintaining of an interest in classical learning was based on an order that Moses had given to the Israelites as they were getting ready to leave Egypt. Exodus records that Moses commanded them to take a variety of things from the Egyptians, their spoils, right? So necklaces, jewelry, other types of fine metals, whatever the Egyptians were willing to give them, and so they were going to spoil the Egyptians. And of course, a lot of that gold and silver and everything eventually gets used to make the tabernacle. And so, for those that were interested in classical learning, they saw themselves much like the Israelites were taking spoils from the Egyptians. Christians could take spoils from classical philosophers because they had conquered their culture. They had conquered Rome and Greece, in a sense. And of course, on the other hand, a lot of those pagans that converted to Christianity were still interested in classical philosophy, classical literature, etc. There were translations and copying of works of these philosophers, treatises on the truthfulness of certain philosophers, arguments about the compatibility with philosophy, between philosophy and Christianity. There was even the preservation of the philosophical emphasis on certain fields of study that carries over into Christianity. There is among a lot of people that are open to this, the desire to kind of reclaim some of those glories of that high classical era. A lot of that can be seen in a few different individuals of the time. We'll look at three. The first is a man named Boethius. Boethius was born to an important family in the city of Rome, a member of the senatorial class, If you remember back to the very beginning, the background, we talked about the senatorial class being the highest class in Roman society. And by this time, in the 6th century is what we're talking about, the senatorial class is mostly Christians at this point. And so this transition from the lower classes to now the upper classes are populated with Christians. He too will get involved in government, much like Gregory did. He becomes consul of Rome in 510, serves as advisor to an Ostrogoth ruler named Theodoric. Right, so he's very well connected with the government. During his life, he will do a variety of works, translate some things related to classical learning. He translates some of Aristotle's works, for example, and then includes commentary on Aristotle. And that does keep some knowledge of Aristotle available through the Middle Ages. But he also writes other books on arithmetic, geometry, music. And this provides the foundation for the basis of education throughout the Middle Ages. Essentially, the Middle Ages looked upon education as being composed of the seven so-called liberal arts, largely helped established by Boethius and others. There was the trivium, the three, grammar, rhetoric, and logic. These were the three very important aspects of classical education, and to that were added the quadrivium, geometry, astronomy, arithmetic, and music. And it was these liberal arts, the physical sciences, mathematics, history, philosophy, the arts, all of these kinds together, that would be the foundation of education throughout the Middle Ages. Often it was believed, especially in the later Middle Ages, that you needed to have an understanding of these fields before you attempted to study theology. So theology is the queen of the sciences. But again, Boethius is also a governmental official, so he's placed, as an advisor, he's placed in charge of domestic administration, foreign policy. After a year in office, he was charged with treason and imprisoned. Right? So, not a successful governmental career. It may have been due to his religious position related to the controversy on Arians. Remember, a lot of the Ostrogoths were Arians. Boethius was a Nicene individual. And so, being Nicene may have conflicted with the Arian theology of most of the Ostrogoths, plus it also connected him with Constantinople, and so fears of conspiracy may have been a part of this as well. It is while in prison that he writes his perhaps most famous work, Constellation of Philosophy. Essentially, it is a dialogue between Boethius and philosophy, who is personified as a woman. The Greek word for philosophy being Sophia, Latin as well, I believe it's feminine as well. And so the word itself had feminine characteristics. And so it's this conversation between him and lady philosophy. And it starts off with Boethius as basically just expressing his bitterness over his imprisonment, but ultimately coming to the conclusion that there is divine providence in spite of the inequalities of the world. Right? History is a wheel for Boethius. Human beings rise and fall. Those in power rise and fall. While he is a Christian, while he is interested in theology, essentially the work doesn't really address too much about Christian themes and doesn't really discuss Jesus either. After a year in prison, he is executed, and to a lot of others, becomes a martyr for the cause, for Christianity.